Berlin Conference still matters, a philosophical, pragmatic and practical perspective. Point 1. The Berlin Conference as a living legacy, not just a historical event. One of the fundamental errors made by those who dismiss the Berlin Conference as mere history is the assumption that history has clean breakpoints. But history is not a museum artifact that stays frozen in time. It is a river that continues to flow, shaping the terrain through which it passes. The Berlin Conference was not merely a moment in history. It was the architectural blueprint of modern Africa's socio-political and economic structure. The boundaries drawn then remain, the economic relationships established then persist, and the geopolitical control mechanisms set in motion are still in effect. To say the Berlin Conference is irrelevant today is like saying that the foundation of a house built 140 years ago has no impact on its structural integrity today. If the walls are cracking, the foundation must be examined. Point 2. The two competing geopolitical blocks, the invisible hands that still shape Africa. A critical point often overlooked is that the Berlin Conference was not just about Africa. It was about Western Europe's geopolitical order and the control of global resources. It was a chess game where Africa was the board, but Africans were not the players. Those same Western powers and their successor states and corporations continue to dictate Africa's economic and political landscape. They remain the predominant investors in African economies, the dominant suppliers of arms and military hardware, fueling conflicts that serve their strategic interests, the key influencers in international decision-making forums, often determining Africa's fate without African voices having real power. Africa is like a tenant in a house where the landlord still holds the keys to every door. The tenant may occupy the space, but real ownership remains elusive. Point 3. The myth of post-colonial independence. Some argue that Africa gained independence in the 1960s and must move forward. However, independence without economic sovereignty is an illusion. The colonial powers did not exit. They rebranded. They transformed from direct colonial rulers to financial and military overlords. African economies remain extractive, with wealth flowing outward rather than inward. Debt dependency, controlled markets, and economic subjugation continue under new names: IMF, World Bank, multinational corporations, foreign aid. If you remove the chains from a prisoner but still control his food supply, his water, and his movement, is he truly free? Point 4. The just move on argument is a weak and dangerous premise. The middle ground argument acknowledging history, but insisting that Africa should move on, is flawed because it ignores the continuing structures of oppression. Would we tell a person whose land was stolen that they should simply forget and build somewhere else without compensation? Would we tell Holocaust survivors to move on without addressing ongoing anti-Semitism and global power imbalances? Would we tell Native Americans to ignore their past while their lands remain occupied? Africa's case is no different. The Berlin Conference cannot be reduced to a lesson in history. It must be studied as a living system of oppression and control that still requires dismantling. Telling Africa to move on without dismantling the effects of Berlin is like telling someone in handcuffs that freedom is a mindset while refusing to give them the key. Point 5. The pragmatic approach. Understanding Berlin as a strategy, not just an event. Rather than merely lamenting the effects of the Berlin Conference, Africa must study why it was successful for its architects and learn from it. They understood control was not just about land, but about economic structures. They built alliances while ensuring Africa remained divided. They established education and media systems that shaped how Africans viewed themselves. They mastered long-term thinking, ensuring their influence outlived colonial rule. This is why we must not just study the Berlin Conference, but reverse engineer it to build an African strategy for the next 100 years. If an enemy builds a fortress that traps you, your first step is not just to complain, it is to study its architecture so you can dismantle it and build your own. Conclusion. Africa must own its narrative and act accordingly. The Berlin Conference is not just a historic event. It is the foundation of modern Africa's challenges. To dismiss it is to ignore the power structures still shaping the continent. We do not study it to remain trapped in the past. We study it to understand how power operates so we can reclaim our future. Africa's history has been written by the hunters, but the lion has awakened. It is time to tell our story, not as victims, but as strategists who understand the game and are ready to reclaim the board. written by Modu, published February 27, 2025.